Well, they are still counting votes in America, especially in California, where the deadline for mail-in ballots to arrive on time to be counted is tomorrow night. Ballots received in the mail tomorrow will be counted in California. So there are literally millions of ballots yet to be counted in this country, including in the state of Pennsylvania, where thousands of votes remain to be counted to determine the balance of the United States Senate. Republicans will probably have 52 senators next year, or 53 if Republicans win the Pennsylvania Senate election. The Democrats will probably have 47 members of the Senate, or 48 if Democrat Bob Casey wins the Pennsylvania Senate race. We still don't know which party will control the House of Representatives, but we do know that it will be very close. As of tonight, Republicans have 214 seats in the House and Democrats have 205 seats in the House, according to NBC News, with 16 remaining to be decided. In the presidential vote, Donald Trump currently has 50.2% of the vote to Kamala Harris's 48.1% of the vote. But that margin will probably narrow after all the California votes are finally counted. And it is possible that Kamala Harris will end up with only a 1% of the vote less than Donald Trump, a 1% gap. Right now, she's at 2% less than Donald Trump. If you hear anyone calling this election a landslide, please stop listening to that person about elections, at least. We have seen landslides in this country, and they don't look like this election. Bill Clinton's reelection was never in doubt in 1996. He won with 49.2% of the vote against Bob Dole's 40.7% of the vote and Ross Perot's 8.4% of the vote. Bill Clinton won by 9 points, and no one called that a landslide because it wasn't. The last landslide we had was Ronald Reagan's reelection in 1984, where he won 49 states in the Electoral College, with only the state of Minnesota voting for Walter Mondale, who was from Minnesota. Ronald Reagan beat Walter Mondale by 18 points. That's what a landslide looks like. There were two landslides before Reagan in the television age. Richard Nixon, in his reelection campaign in 1972, won 49 states with only Massachusetts voting against him. Nixon beat George McGovern by 23 points. But in both of those Republican landslides, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, the Democrats still easily controlled the House of Representatives. President Lyndon Johnson won a landslide victory in 1964 after the assassination of President Kennedy elevated Vice President Johnson to the presidency. In the 1964 election, the Democrats won 97 seats in the House, 97 more seats in the House, and they added 12 seats in the Senate. That's what they added to their margins. And no one thought that that was really remarkable, because the Democrats had been accustomed to having huge margins in the House and in the Senate, just huge margins. And as strong as Republicans, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, were in their presidential reelection campaigns, they couldn't come close to ever winning the House of Representatives for the Republicans. Tonight, Donald Trump is already chipping away at whatever the Republican count might end up being in the House of Representatives by choosing two newly reelected Republican members of the House to serve in his administration. The Trump ambassador to the United Nations will be Northern New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, a graduate of Harvard College who has much more foreign policy experience than Nikki Haley did when Donald Trump chose her as his first ambassador to the United Nations. Elise Stefanik has called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. She did oppose funding for Ukraine on the basis that the Biden administration had not done enough to secure the southern border, not on the actual situation Ukraine is facing. Elise Stefanik has said that Ukraine has a right to defend itself against Russian aggression. In other words, Elise Stefanik is not Marjorie Taylor Greene. She is as close to an establishment choice as is left in what has become the Republican Party. So, too, you might say, with Donald Trump's choice for National Security Advisor announced today, Florida Republican Congressman Mike Waltz, He's a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. He's a former Green Beret who has served on the Armed Services Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, and Intelligence Committee. He has, of course, been a Trump loyalist in the House of Representatives and said very stupid things in support of Donald Trump, as they all have. But he, too, is now about as close to a Republican establishment choice as is possible in what is left of the current Republican Party. Donald Trump's first choice of National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, survived exactly 2 weeks on the job before Donald Trump fired him under the heat of an FBI investigation about Flynn's possible illegal activity during the Trump transition in December of 2016. Last month, Michael Flynn said, when Donald Trump wins, quote, "Bar the door, believe me, the gates of hell, my hell, will be unleashed." Well, they won't be unleashed from the job of National Security Advisor. Michael Flynn's not getting his old job back, the one he lasted 2 weeks in. That's not happening. That's how much worse it could be. We're looking at the difficult frame of how bad can it be? It could be worse. Donald Trump's first choice of National Security Advisor 8 years ago was an unrestrained madman. And that is not the direction Donald Trump is going tonight. And it, of course, raises the question of who is making these decisions? Who is making what could be considered relatively safe choices for the Trump administration? Who decided, for example, to basically give Stephen Miller his old job back and nothing more? Stephen Miller's new title is going to be Deputy White House Chief of Staff in charge of domestic policy. That's basically what he was doing in the last Trump White House when he was called a senior advisor on domestic policy. It's not a Senate confirmation job. It's not a member of the cabinet. And so far, this looks like a Trump administration chosen by White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, a Republican establishment figure herself, who won her White House job by being Donald Trump's campaign manager. Donald Trump also announced, as Rachel and I were discussing, that Tom Homan will be a so-called border czar. We do not know what that means. If he had been chosen as Secretary of Homeland Security, we would know what that means, and he would have some real authority. Or if he was given his old job back as Director of the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we would know what that meant, and he would have some real authority. Apparently, someone else will get those jobs, the ones with real authority. It seems unlikely that the so-called border czar job, which Donald Trump is inventing, will require Senate confirmation. I mean, it certainly won't if he's just inventing that job. National Security Advisor job does not require Senate confirmation, but Ambassador to the United Nations does, as do all the other cabinet positions. And today, Donald Trump demanded that the United States Senate simply give up 235 years of history and constitutional duty by throwing away the confirmation process. Donald Trump seems to have a bunch of unconfirmable possible nominees in mind, so he told the United States Senate, quote, "Any Republican senator seeking the coveted leadership position in the United States Senate must agree to recess appointments in the Senate, exclamation point, without which we will not be able to get people confirmed in a timely manner. Sometimes the votes can take 2 years or more. This is what they did 4 years ago, and we cannot let it happen again. We need positions filed immediately." If Donald Trump tries to get Robert Kennedy Jr. confirmed by the Senate to any job, it would be possibly the ugliest confirmation hearing in history because of the number of people who have grievances against him, from women who have accused him of physical abuse to the mothers of possibly thousands of people who are dead because they followed Robert Kennedy Jr.'s poisonous medical advice. The confirmation hearing of Robert Kennedy Jr. would be a televised examination of a crazed incompetent. And that might just set the tone for a Trump administration. And so Donald Trump says, just throw away the Constitution and skip the Senate confirmation process. Never mind that many presidents have had dozens of members of their administration confirmed on the very first day of their presidencies. That's how Senate confirmation works when you don't nominate crazy people. There are 3 candidates for Majority Leader of the United States Senate. The front runner, as of today, was probably John Thune of South Dakota, followed by John Cornyn of Texas, with Florida's Rick Scott probably running third. But all of that could have changed when Rick Scott today immediately promised to obey Donald Trump and bypass the Senate confirmation process. The vote for Senate Majority Leader is done in secret within the Republican Party in a room where the door is closed, no one but Republican senators. We'll have more on the importance of that vote, which will occur tomorrow night, later in this program. It is now very clear that if White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles is going to try to run an orderly White House, her second biggest problem after Donald Trump is going to be Elon Musk. For the first time in history, during a phone call between a president-elect and the president of another country, a private citizen, rich businessman jumped on the call. Donald Trump handed the phone to Elon Musk during a call with Ukraine's President Zelensky. President Roosevelt never handed the phone to Henry Ford when he was talking to a foreign leader. Why couldn't Donald Trump get through that phone call on his own? Imagine if Joe Biden handed the phone to some private citizen during a presidential call with a head of state. Imagine the outrage we'd hear from the Trump-supporting media. If Elon Musk were taking it all seriously in the American business community, the stock market would have crashed when Elon Musk agreed that we should abolish the Federal Reserve. But because Wall Street has come to understand that Elon Musk is at least as clownish as Donald Trump, no one in the investing community actually thinks the Federal Reserve is threatened by a new Trump administration. Last week, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said no, he would not leave if Donald Trump tried to fire him. The president does not have the authority to fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who was appointed to a 5-year term. Jerome Powell was actually first appointed to the Federal Reserve by Donald Trump, of course, and then he was reappointed to another 5-year term by Joe Biden. Speaking of things the president cannot do, Donald Trump cannot withdraw the United States from the NATO alliance. NATO was formed by the North Atlantic Treaty, which was passed in the Senate in 1949. The House of Representatives does not vote on treaties. Like the confirmation process, the approval of treaties lies exclusively within the United States Senate. But removing the United States from NATO would now require a 2/3 vote by both the Senate and the House of Representatives, according to a new bipartisan law co-sponsored by Senator Marco Rubio, who is reported tonight to be Donald Trump's choice for Secretary of State in the coming Trump administration. That resolution, co-written by Marco Rubio, says the president shall not suspend, terminate, denounce, or withdraw the United States from the North Atlantic Treaty until such time as both the Senate and the House of Representatives pass by an affirmative vote of 2/3 of members a joint resolution approving the withdrawal of the United States from the treaty or pursuant to an act of Congress. The breaking news of the night, which should come as no surprise, is the New York Times reporting Susie Wiles, the next White House Chief of Staff, privately told a group of Republican donors on Monday that President-elect Donald J. Trump would move on his first day in office to reinstate several executive orders from Mr. Trump's first term that President Biden had revoked, according to 2 people in the room who insisted on anonymity to describe the closed-door remarks. Susie Wiles said something else in that room that is very true and should give important hope to Democrats. The New York Times reports Ms. Wiles emphasized to the group that the window for Mr. Trump to revolutionize government was more like 2 years rather than 4, It appeared to be an acknowledgement that most presidents face a difficult midterm election after 2 years in office.